Alright, so this is developmental psychology, so we're looking at development, and the way the class is set up and the way our book is set up is that we do that chronologically. So what we're doing is we're looking at development based on specific periods, or we could call them age groups, and I have those listed there on the screen so you can read over them. And each of these age groups or time periods that we have here, they're developmental milestones, and there's often some type of transition that is going on during each of these stages of development. And you see there, for example, so young adulthood, that's about when, we all come outside of our parents' house and we start establishing our own lives and get things like having our own house. And these periods, they're kind of set, but they're really not, because they're just kind of approximations, and they will vary with culture. Alright, so within each of these age groups, we're going to specifically focus on 3 types of development. That'll be physical development, cognitive development, and socio-emotional development. So physical development, of course, that's our change in our physical body. So, how we grow taller and how we grow older, things like that. And then cognitive development, that relates to mental type things. So things involving our brains and things like our intellect, memory, how we go about, using language, how we go about problem solving, and just all those kind of mental activities that we have that goes on in our heads. And then last, we have social-emotional development, and that really relates to our feelings and our motivation, and how those relate to kind of the broader context of society. And, because when it comes down to it, our environmental influences play a huge role on our development, and especially in the context of how we relate to others. And, all of these, when we're looking at development, we don't really focus on one of these types specifically, because they kind of all 3 work together. So that's why we kind of say they're a little arbitrary there as far as the borders of those those types of development goes, because sometimes, they interplay and interact with each other. So your cognitive development is going to relate to your socio-emotional development and your physical development. A good example would be adolescence. Think about all those, all those changes that go on during adolescence and our teenage years, and, we can pick out all 3 of these during that time span, right? Alright, so why do we study development? And we study development because as psychologists, we are interested in human beings. We're also interested in animals too. So basically what it is we're interested in thought and behavior and how those interact with each other. And we see throughout our lifespan as we grow and change that, our thoughts and our behaviors and the way we relate to others also grows and change. Alright, so for developmental psychology, we have 4 goals. That first goal is to describe, the second is to explain, the third is to predict, and the fourth is intervene. And all of that, of course, relates to the ideas of development and changes that we go through. And those should sound familiar to you if you have taken any other kind of psychology class, especially an introductory psychology class, because those are basically the 4 main goals of psychology. And then, of course, psychology overall, we study human and animal thoughts and behavior. And then, it's in the context of those 4 goals. The only difference here is that for developmental psychology, our last goal is to intervene or use knowledge to help enhance the quality of individual lives. That means that what we learn about development, we're presenting that back to society to help peoples, and that's kind of like that's a main underwritten goal of psychology too. We study thought and behavior so that we can essentially help people obtain, optimal health and well-being and happiness, and as Maslow would say, to help them self-actualize. All right. So, like I said, that difference there is that in main psychology, we say that last goal is to control human behavior, and it's really in the same context there. We want to control human behavior so that we can understand it, and then, like our fourth goal here, and then use that knowledge to help people. Alright, so when it comes down to it, we have 4 basic questions about human development. And these 4 questions really focus around the whole nature versus nurture and debate that has been going on for centuries. And make sure that when you go into the Canvas shell that you read the Module 1 overview, because that's the information I give you in the overview. I talk about nature versus nurture, and then I give you some of those different ideas and theories that relate to that. And you'll notice here at the bottom that I have a link to a YouTube video. It's a little 10-minute video that talks about the nature versus nurture debate. I don't want to play that video during the lecture, so you will be responsible to go and watch that video, and the activities that I have for you to do that go along with this lecture. There will be some questions related to the video, so make sure you watch those. Most of them are about, I think there's 3 or 4 I have throughout the lecture, and none of them are over 12 minutes, I believe. So super short and super sweet and to the point, and super interesting little videos there too. Alright, so our 4 questions about the nature of human development are, our first one are, what aspects of development are universal and which aspects vary from one individual or group to the next? So universals are these kind of aspects of culture that we see present in all cultures across the globe. So things like religion or just basic belief systems are universal because all cultures have those. Things like specialization of labor, so having specific people who are good at specific types of jobs, like people who are maybe better at agriculture, so they're the farmers, and then you have people who are better at artistic stuff, so maybe they're like the engineers and the architecturalists, so like things of that nature. Other universals would be things like marriage, even though we all go about marriage a different way. In every culture there is some kind of contract between individuals. Let's see, what are some other good examples of universals? Some of our personality traits, according to Carl Jung, we can see those as universals. Things I have listed here, things like self-esteem, intelligence, artistic ability. They're all universals, but the way that they contribute to development is going to vary with culture, because the way we denote intelligence in our Western society is going to be different from the way, we'll say, the Mbuti, the little pygmies that live in the Congo jungles deep in Africa. Their standards of intelligence are going to be different because they live in a different environment for us. So the things that they need to survive to make and what they consider smart are going to be different from the things that we consider make us smart and help us survive. So hopefully that makes sense. Alright, so our second question here is which aspects are continuous and which are not. And so basically what we're looking at there is we're looking at specific traits in development that, we can see throughout an individual's lifetime. And also we're looking at how those specific traits or aspect, relate to that person's personality and maybe present or future state, as in how they'll be in the present or how they're going to be in the future. Some good examples of that are, there are a lot of studies, and if you've taken abnormal psychology, you might be familiar with this, but there are studies that look at children that are diagnosed with ADHD and criminal behavior. They've done studies to show that, looking at adult criminals who had been diagnosed with ADHD as children and seeing if maybe there's a link between that, which, the inference or the the hypothesis and the kind of the conclusion is that children that are diagnosed with ADHD tend to grow up to be criminals as adults, and there are studies that say that they also grow up to maybe be psychopaths, and we've actually just changed that definition. We don't call psychopaths anymore. They are now classified as antisocial personality disorder, and so interesting stuff there if you ever want to look that up. And looking at other traits, so another thing would be like studies they do on things like eating the habits and how, what you eat as a child, if that relates to obesity or maybe getting diabetes later on in life. Alright, and third, we want to look at aspects of developments that are more or less fixed and ones that are, they're difficult to change, and then whether we have ones that are kind of malleable and easy to change. So a good example of this would be gender roles. Now, as you know, or hopefully you know, gender roles are really a social construct, and this really relates to the nature versus nurture debate, because we look at it in the context of, are we born knowing that we're males or females, or does society impose that on us? Because even in utero, as babies are inside their mother's stomachs during pregnancy, they're a little aware of what's going on in the outside world. There are studies that show that babies can hear their mother's voices. Maybe even classical music will, influence development. And so my point with that is that even when we're inside our mama's bellies, we are, kind of getting this influence of, especially if we already know what the baby type is, we're getting that influence of, okay, it's going to be a girl, so, you talk to the baby in the girl's name, and you're kind of putting that gender identity on to the baby. And then once, the baby is born and it comes out, think about then the social construct of gender roles. Girls you associate with the color pink, boys with the color blue, girls play with dolls, boys play with trucks. And so in looking at all of that, that idea is it because, we make girls wear pink and play with dolls that they grow up knowing that they're females and behaving as females? Or is it, like I said, is it something that is innate inside of us? And a real good controversial study that was done on this was done by a psychologist, John Money, and we call it the David Reimer experiment. And I do have a little handout that is posted in Canvas that kind of goes in and explains Money's experiment there. So just real quickly, Money thought that gender was a social construct, and basically he thought that if when a baby was born, say it was a little boy, if you took that baby boy as soon as it came out of its mother and you dressed it in girls' clothes, you gave it girls' toys, and you treated that baby like it was a girl, that baby would then indeed grow up thinking it was a girl and behaving as a girl. And that's exactly what Money did in his study with this baby, and so that's why the baby's David Reimer is the name of the participant there. And it's actually a pretty wild study. A lot of the APA ethical codes and standards that we have for experiments today are, because of these really controversial experiments that we had in the past. And so Money's experiment, like I said, even though it's really controversial, it's still really interesting. And in conclusion, no, you cannot dress a little boy up like a little girl and tell it it's a little girl and it's going to grow up and be a little girl. It doesn't work that way. Interesting to note, I think Money did that study back in the 70s, and now with all the attention we have on, the transgender community and things like gender identities, it would be interesting to see if maybe we could replicate some of these kind of studies nowadays, in the context of some of those issues that are floating around. So just something interesting to think about there. And our last question here is, what makes development happen? So we're really looking at the factors that influence development and why those factors influence development. So we're looking at things that what motivates individuals. We're looking at, things like culture, things like discrimination, socioeconomic status, and how those play a role in our development. And then again, too, we can't forget those biological side of it. So we're also looking at biological factors that influence our development. Alright, so when we say development, what exactly are we talking about? And simply, when we're talking about development, we can say that it is simply growth and change over time. However, development is a little more complex than that. And so we take that idea of growth and change over time and kind of expand it out into these three specific areas. So we're looking at growth and change over time as how it relates to kind of survivability. As human beings, we survive, and we do that because we're problem solvers. We do that because we are social creatures, and we survive the most because we can adapt to our environments. And so in developmental psychology, we're looking at how adapting to our environments influences our development. We're looking at development as a procession, so we're kind of looking at it as that simple relativistic side of it, and then we move it up and get more to that global, more complex and specific aspects of it. So think of it like language. As babies, we just kind of start kind of gurgling and cooing, and then we eventually learn to say a word, and then from there we start learning more words, and then we learn how to put those words together into sentences, and then we learn abstract thought, and we start learning more about concepts, and like I have there, greater use of tense. And then we're looking at development and the idea of, is it enduring or is it fleeting? So along those lines, what we're really talking about is we're looking at the growth and change that either helps us adapt and survive, or we're looking at aspects of growth and change that maybe not so much help us out. So those would be those like fleeting ones. So, in short, development is the relatively enduring growth and change that makes an individual better adapted to the environment by enhancing his or her ability to engage in, understand, and experience more complex behavior, thinking, and emotions. And basically, to summarize that up, we're once again going back to that idea of survivability. As social creatures, we have to be able to engage each other, understand each other, have these emotions and work together. And the way that, we grow and change over time plays a key role in all of those endeavors. Alright, next, so we have our guiding and principles, and when it comes to developmental psychology, we have 5 key principles. And pretty much these are the key principles that influence all our experiments, our inquiries, and just pretty much all our thinking and ideas about development, or you could say like our projections of development, right? So the first principle there is development results from the constant interplay of biology and the environment. And so that right there is, the crust of the nature versus nurture argument. We're saying that really when it comes down to it, development, thoughts, behaviors, they're influenced by only one or the other. It's only biology, nature, or it's environmental nurture, which is, environmental nurture, outside influence like social environments, and even our natural environments. If you want to throw in eco-psychologists and transpersonal psychologists, they definitely look at the natural environment and how that relates to our development. A good one is Bill Plotkin, and we'll actually look at him later on in this semester. So when it comes down to it, the way that we grow and change has to do with biology. So that's hereditary, that's our genes, that's all the traits and that are genetically transmitted to us. And sometimes, genes, they can be dominant or they can be regressive. So maybe sometimes we have a genetic tendency that is expressed, and then sometimes we have one that aren't expressed. And here we say that they're expressed depending on the child's experiences, and that's true too. But sometimes genes are kind of a funny and tricky thing because there are so many of them, and we're just barely scratching the surface of what's going on there. But some genes are just regressive because maybe it's like we're just not using them. Think of it kind of like latent learning. It's like where you learn something but you don't use that information right off the bat. It's like it's something that you store away for future information. And so depending on the outside environmental influences, we can have dreams that genes that kind of lay dormant, but then say maybe 3 generations later something happens, and that gene decides to not be dormant anymore and express itself. Right? All right, and then we look at our second principle here is that development is multi-layer context, and that kind of relates to the idea that society is like an onion, and I can't remember the sociologist who came up with that, but so the idea is that an onion has these different layers, and each of those layers, and in order for society to function, we need each of those layers, and those layers interact with each other. You can also think of it like a clock and all the little parts that make up a clock. In order for that clock to work, you need all those little gears and sprockets all turning right. And so when it comes down to it, whether we're looking at healthy or non-healthy development, we're looking at it in that multi-layered context, and we're looking at all these different things that influence our development. Remember what I just said, we're looking at throughout class, we're going to look at development on physical, cognitive, and those social, emotional. So think about it in that context. Those are all different parts of the layer that interact with each other in our development. Oh, and just to point out there, history, depending on where we were at and what's going on in the larger society, really plays a role in how we view development too. So that's why we have that historical period there too. It's really interesting because when it comes down to it, historically, the way that we view things like behavior and say like abnormal psychology and normal behavior, if you go back and look through each time period, everybody kind of has their own little unique perspective on human thought and behavior, and so it's kind of interesting to look at and then to think about how we have redefined all those ideas and kind of claim them for our own today, which is something that we like to do as humans, right? We like to share, we like to kind of take stuff from each other and kind of change that around and make it our own thing. Alright, our third principle is development is dynamic reciprocal process. So what that means is that it is ever changing, and it just depends on who you are as an individual, what situation that you are put in, and it's constantly going to be changing, and it's reciprocal too, because reciprocal, it's I can't say that word, but it basically means it's a relationship of give and change. It's an exchange of something, and so that give and change there in our development relates back to how we think, how we behave, how we interact with others, how other people interact with us. That definitely influences who we are and who we become as individuals, right? Fourth, development is cumulative. I can't say that word either. And what that means is it's like a process that builds upon itself. And when we think about it, think about your life and the experiences that you have had in life. The experiences you've had in the past, they kind of, you learn from those experiences. Hopefully we learn from our experiences so that we don't repeat those negative ones, right? But, as we go through life, situations emotions people present themselves, and those tend to change over time. And so, as we tend to grow and change over time, we build upon all of those, and that's what helps shape us into the person that we are today. And as we move through life, our experiences will shape our future selves. And a way to look at that is kind of development is a kind of trajectory. All right, our last principle here is that development occurs throughout the lifespan. And this may seem kind of a common sense to us, but when it comes down to it in developmental psychology, a lot of the theories we have, they didn't see it this way. They thought that once you hit that age of adulthood, like, development stopped. Like, you turn 18 or 20, we'll say about 18 to 20 is when we define adulthood. And once you get to that stage, you go from there to your death, and no more development ever occurs. And that's not true. We know that from our own lives, that we constantly grow and change with each new experience, and with each age group that we move to. And like I said, it seems common sense, but really some of these theories, as we'll see here in a few minutes, they thought that it stopped. And so it's a good thing that that's the one thing about psychology, is it is a dynamic field. The more we learn about human behavior and how we think and engage others, that influences what we know, and how we can kind of get that deeper understanding of kind of just the world and what's going on with us. Alright, so those were our 5 principles, and so now what we're going to do is go and change to our theories. And when it comes down to it, all sciences start with a theory, and a theory is a set of ideas or principles based on empirical evidence that explains related natural phenomenon. So basically what we're saying is that we're observing phenomenon. So phenomenon, that's, once again, it can be thoughts, it can be behavior, interactions with others. And when it comes to a development, how we grow, that's all phenomenon. And we always start with this set of ideas, these theories, because that's how we're able to organize our thinking, and able to really hone in on those specific things, so that we find that significance in the phenomenon that we are studying, and then that helps us generate those new ideas, and which in turn helps us help people, and hopefully make life better. And when it comes down to it, I kind of just said this, but in a different way, but these theories are flexible. It goes back to that idea of back to that context of dynamic, is that just like everything in life, our theories will grow and change with the more we learn, and with more evidence and data. Alright, so when it comes down to theories of development, we have 2 main groups here, and those are the classic theories and the contemporary theories. And you see I have then the main theories listed there for those. And so when we're developing our theories, our set of ideas on development, we're really looking at the core, the key question here of how does development happen? And for most developmentalists, developmental psychologists, developmental scientists, whatever you want to call them, you'll find in psychology that we kind of have multiple words to describe the same thing. And most of the scientists think that development occurs in stages, but some of the contemporary theories, like I said, it's dynamic, things change with time. So with some of these more contemporary theories, though, we look at development as more of a gradual process, and we don't really see any major qualitative changes, but more quantitative changes in there. And I'm not sure which theory I agree the most with. They all kind of have their little points that make a lot of sense. And like everything in life, and especially in psychology, when we go about looking at these theories and we think about how they apply to life, we always want to do it from a holistic standpoint. So basically, that holistic standpoint is we want to look at a little bit of everything. We can also maybe in a way call it Gestalt psychology, is where the sum is made up of all parts of the whole. So, we want to look at each part and figure out how that relates to our development. That's how we get that wider understanding and perspective of development, or, like I said, just anything that relates to our thoughts and our behaviors. So our first theory of development is going to be Freud and psychoanalysis. And basically with psychoanalysis, it says here, we're focused on the inner self and how emotions determine the way we interpret our experiences and how we act. For Freud, he was really looking at unconscious motivations and how those influenced our behavior. For Freud, he believed that we will ultimately controlled by the eros and the thanatos, which is our sex drive and our aggression drive. And then if you've had an introductory psychology class, you know that Freud, he took the mind and put it into three parts. We have the id, that's another one. But he had the conscious, the subconscious, and the unconscious. And then, of course, he breaks those up into the id, the ego, and the superego. And basically, when it comes down to it, he thought that these eros and thanatos, these urges that we have, they dictated our behavior. And so those lied in our id. They're like our primitive survival instincts. And our ego there was kind of the conscious mind, and it was kind of the one that was related to the reality principle, as Freud called it, and that means that it's the part of our mind that's focused kind of on like the rational, kind of logical, here, present, moment type sense. And then the superego, it was kind of like the mediator. It was kind of its job is like to keep those other two parts in check. And that's kind of what the ego does for the id too. Well, actually, the ego is the one that keeps everybody in check. What the superego does is, as the mediator, it's kind of that one that questions, that gets, keeps that balance. Keeps the ego and the id both in check. But the ego also kind of keeps the id in check, and we'll talk about this more maybe in a Freud class there. I don't want to get too overboard here, but I really like Freud. He's one of my favorite psychologists, so I could go on and on about him. So for Freud, he based development on what we call the psychosexual stages, and each one of them was related to a specific age group, and it had to do with how an individual relates to reality and kind of learning self-control, like I say here, there a few points down. And so let me point this out before I move on, and I'll go show us some stages and explain those here in just a minute. So for Freud, he thought that healthy development that comes about when the ego starts to emerge. And in order to move up the stages of development, there's always some type of conflict that's occurring. And so if you don't move up that stage of development, then you kind of get stuck in it. And once again, there's a little YouTube video. Make sure you go watch that. It explains Freud and his psychosexual development. So alright, here is a chart which with each of Freud's stages there, and like I see as you go through, look at this. So we have the first stage. This is the oral stage, and this is from this is infancy. At this stage in life, we're focused on being fed, so that's why the mouth, the tongue, the lips, babies are fixated on suckling, getting nutrition, and so that's kind of what we're fixated on, right? Now, if you don't move above the oral stage as you go through and develop in life, that's when we see these things called fixations occurring. And Fixation would be something like smoking or something like overeating, something that involves fixating on the mouth, all right? So then the next stage here would be the anal stage. And for Freud, he thought that, our behavior as adults and kind of even as we developed throughout childhood, that it was really related to how we were toilet trained. So the fixation here would be kind of, think of it, anal fixation. Someone who is anal, it means they're very, very orderly, very structured, and don't really tolerate any silliness or messiness of that. And Freud believes that's because they probably had very strict toilet training. And then on the other side of that, we have people who aren't anally fixated, but they're just, they had toilet training to where their parents were very free and open with them, and so maybe they get stuck in that stage. And so those type of people are like, they really like to share, they really like to, include everybody else in what they're doing, and they're really messy at times. And then the next stage here, I'm not going to go through all of these, but these are kind of, the first three really are the most interesting ones here, especially when we get here to the phallic stage. And the phallic stage is where we have the Oedipus complex. Hopefully you guys have heard about that before, but that's kind of the idea of that little girl. Well, we also have and penis envy. So the idea here is that from 3 to 6 years, children are kind of stuck. They're fixated on the opposite sex parent. So for little boys, they're focused on their mothers, which would be the Oedipus complex. And then for little boys, they're focused on their dads. But for Freud, it was kind of he was kind of a little weird there, and he came up with the whole idea of penis envy. It's because, above everything, what do boys love the most? What do men love the most? It's the one thing that girls don't have, and so girls kind of get mad that they don't have a penis, and so they kind of start acting out against their mother, and they start trying to identify and be more like their father. And yeah, some crazy stuff there, but it's also really interesting stuff. And when we look back, at Freud's theory, we do think, oh God, this stuff's so crazy. But you got to think about it in context. Freud did work with people and came up with these ideas, and Freud was a psychologist that helped people. So some of what he's saying here does apply to some type of people. With a lot of these other developmental theories, we'll see how it's more broader and it can apply to all of us. But just keep that in mind when we're studying Freud. It's okay if we don't all go through all these stages, and or if we don't all experience these type of fixations. Just know that some people do, and there might be something here what Freud's talking about. Alright, next, so Freud is really the main one we look at there when it comes to development, and from that we then get Erikson's. So Erik Erikson was one of the first developmental psychologists, and of course he studied psychoanalysis. When it comes down to it, a lot of the famous psychologists that we talk about and will talk about, a lot of them were students of Freud's, and psychoanalysis was a huge thing when it came about at the beginning of the 19th century, and if you look at it historically, it really changed society, and especially the development of technology in what we call mass society. So interesting stuff going on there, and it just makes sense that if you went into psychology, and even today if you go into psychology, you're going to learn about Freud, and like I said, pretty much everybody studied under him. And so what then Erikson did is, he took Freud's theory and he kind of differentiated, because he argued that personality, it wasn't fixed. So, where you got fixed in, say, that oral fixation or that anal fixation, and that kind of followed you throughout life. Erikson thought that, no, that was something that you could kind of overcome, and something that continued to develop. So it's kind of like, you move along, you don't stay in fixed stages, but, he's looking more at the dynamicism of behavior there. And then when it comes down to it, Erikson also differed from Freud in that idea of, like I said, Freud was all about that inner conflict, those unconscious desires and urges, and how those related to our behavior. And Erikson didn't think that these conflicts were more inner, but that they were more a result of our social environment. And when it comes down to it, whereas Freud's stages were kind of fixed there. For Erikson, transitioning from those stages, it has cultural norms have a lot to do with it too. And when we're looking at cultural norms, we're looking at what does society expect of its members at that certain stage, and what are the social conditions surrounding that stage, and how do we come out of those stages. So a lot of times Erikson looked at not really at calling them conflicts, these transitions from stage to stage, but he called them identity crises. Alright, so here is a chart that shows Erikson's stages of development. And like I said there, there's some kind of conflict that you have to overcome. So, let's go down to old age as an example here. So old age, say 65 to death, where conflict is integrity versus despair. And what that's talking about there is that, for most cultures, once you get to that old age in life, you're kind of useless, right? And, not all cultures think that way. In fact, our Western culture is a little different in that sense, because we do treat our elderly with less respect than other cultures do. And a lot of other cultures, the elderly, they're the ones with all the wisdom and all the life experiences. So, it's like really important for members of society to listen to what they have to say. Whereas with us, what do? Grandma gets old and we lock her up in a nursing home and dope her up, right? So the conflict there is this integrity versus despair. And that despair is kind of what I've just described. It's like once you get to that stage in development, do you give in to those ideas of, okay, now I'm old, I just need to go walk out in the woods and lay down and die, I'm useless? Or do you have integrity? Do you say, no, wait a minute, I'm not dead yet, I'm going to keep going, and, I'm going to go until, I drop. And so that's kind of the conflict you have to overcome. It's kind of this personal thing inside of us. And we have these virtues here that Erikson associates with each of his stage, because, depending on how you react to that conflict, and hopefully you do it on the, kind of the more positive side there, because if you kind of go through and look at these, one's a little more positive and one's a little more negative. And when you do it on that positive side, then you have acquired this virtue, or another way to say the virtue is that personality trait. So hopefully that makes sense. Alright, moving along here. Next we have the learning theory. And learning theory, we're really getting away from Freud here, because we're really looking at those outside environmental influences and the role that they play in our behaviors and our development. And this is kind of where, even though psychology is all about thought and behavior, there are different branches of psychology. We actually call them different waves too. And when psychology first started, it started with structuralism, and then it went on to functionalism, and then psychoanalysis, and then humanism. And then next we have, we kind of debate, because then we have multicultural psychology, we have positive psychology, transpersonal psychology, integral psychology, and the list goes on and on of since like the 60s to the 80s, all the new psychological fields and kind of ways of thoughts there. But behavioralism is actually the third wave of psychology, and the way that it differs from other fields or theories of psychology is that with behavioralism, we are not looking at the influence of thinking. Alright, so with behaviorism, we're looking at behavior only. We don't care what the person's thinking that led them to respond the way that they did. All we are looking at is how that person responds. And so when it comes to the learning theory, that's exactly what we're looking at, is we're looking at how that person responds in the context of how do they learn. So, it's not, once again, we're not, think of it as math. If you go and you take like an algebra or more complicated math, you have to do that show your work, and you show all those necessary little steps you took to get the answer you want. All those steps that you write down, those are the thought process of that behavior, of, coming up with that answer. And so that's kind of the same thing, they don't, so for the behavioralists, for learning, people who apply learning theory, they don't want you to show your work, they just want to see that answer and kind of observe what you did right there in the moment to get that answer. They're not, they don't care what's going on in your head about it. So hopefully that makes sense too. Oh, here's good. Let me point this out too. And so when it comes down to it with the learning theory, the reason that we're just looking at behavior is because it comes back to kind of data and making our research and our testings valid and reliable. When we're looking at the way people react, then we can gauge that standard for, how people are going to react to what is being learned, regardless of who that individual is. We're always going to see that same type of behavior. Alright, and so I just kind of explained behaviorism to you there, so I don't want to spend too much time here actually reading off all of this. So there is, once again, make sure you go watch that little YouTube video. It kind of explains all of this, but like I said, behaviorism, they're all about the observable behavior. They don't care about the mind, the cognitive process of it. And behaviorism started with Ivan Pavlov. Hopefully you guys remember that experiment. Pavlov and his dogs. He taught the dogs to salivate. And we call that classical conditioning. And with classical conditioning, we're looking at reaction to a stimulus. So, it's always something is going to create you to react a certain way. And so, it's like the ringing of the bell made the dog salivate because they knew that they were going to get fed. So it's a reaction to stimulus based on associations. That's a good way to say it. Another real famous study from a behavioralist was Watson, and just like John Money, Watson also had a highly controversial experiment, and that was one of the reasons why we have our APA ethical codes now. But with Watson, he did his experiment on the baby little Albert, where he, with Watson, he believed that fear wasn't something that was ingrained in us. It was just a reaction to that outside stimulus. And so he conditioned the little baby to be afraid of any kind of fuzzy kind of object that resembled this white rat. And the way he went about, conditioning that response into the baby was he would make a real loud noise, and then he would present that white rat. And so so that was the association. Every time he'd hear that noise, that's probably more what was scaring the kid. But having that white rat there, that's kind of what the he was responding to, because that's kind of what he was looking at. And so then anything that would look like that white rat, he was really scared of. And so that's why it was controversial, because people were aghast that somebody would make somebody be afraid of something. This is kind of what creates phobias. And sadly enough, little Albert was not a healthy child, and not because of Watson's experiments, but he only lived to be a couple years old, I do believe. Later on, after Watson did this experiment, another psychologist came in. I can't remember her name, but she came in and did a little Peter experiment. So she conditioned the fear response, but then she went back and she counter-conditioned it, and she took that fear response away. She made it go extinct. So interesting stuff in the world of psychology, especially in the past when everybody was kind of allowed to just run amok. And then from classical conditioning, then we have operant conditioning, and we always associate B.F. Skinner with operant conditioning, but another good psychologist is Thorndike. I believe it's Edward Thorndike. He's kind of really the one who started operant conditioning, but Skinner is more famous for it. And operant conditioning, it's basically based on a systems of rewards and punishments. So it's how we respond to stimulus, and if it's going to be a good response or if it's going to be a negative response. And then those, depending on if it's positive or negative, that then is going to indicate or dictate the behavior to that stimulus, right? And then when it comes to operant conditioning, we really want to distinguish the fact that it can be intentional or unintentional. This is one of the main differences between classical conditioning and operant conditioning. With classical conditioning, it's all based on our autonomic nervous system. So it's kind of these just kind of innate and autonomous responses. It's kind of like we can't control it. So once again, think about Pavlov and his dogs. Their innate response is to salivate when they're hungry or when they're presented with food. They can't not do that. Or when we're presented with a fearful situation, and our heartbeat were elevated, maybe we perspire a little bit. Those are based on our autonomic nervous systems, and we don't have much control over those. But when it comes to operant conditioning, the way that we behave, it's totally based on our individual choice. Alright, so a good way to look at that is to go back to this idea of its reward and punishment. If you're constantly rewarded for a behavior, more than likely you're going to repeat that behavior. So let's say little Susie cleans up her room without her mother nagging her, and mother comes in and says, "Well done, little Susie, you cleaned up your room, so good job, you get a gold star for the day," or something like that. That's positive reinforcement. That positive praise, that positive affirmation from her mother is more than likely going to encourage little Susie to continue to clean up her room. Now, if a behavior is not rewarded, then it'll probably go away. So we call that extinguished. So something like, little Billy, mom's talking on the phone, and little Billy comes in, or here, no, this is even better. Every time mom goes to talk on the phone, little Billy runs in and wants to talk to her and yells and screams and shows his little Billy butt, right? And so if the mother were to acknowledge that behavior, it's going to make that kid continue to act that way. Best case scenario is ignore what little Billy is doing, and little Billy will see that he's not getting the reward he wants, attention from his mother at that time. And so eventually little Billy will give up. He'll be like, well, I'm not getting attention by doing this type of behavior, so I'll stop doing that type of behavior and hopefully turn towards a more positive behavior that his mother will positively reward him for. So hopefully that's my little operating classical conditioning in a nutshell. And like I said, a little YouTube video there, it goes in a little bit more detail. And of course the book talks about all this stuff too. So when it comes to looking at abnormal behavior and abnormal psychology, because that's always a big part of psychology too, we look at healthy behavior, healthy thoughts and actions as much as we look at unhealthy thoughts and actions. And so when it comes to behavior, when it comes to therapy for behavioralists, that's a key part of their therapy, is that trying to change that negative behavior into something that's positive and productive. So a good one would be the idea of overcoming phobias, and something like that would be probably like gradual introduction. So say, here's a good scenario. Jane is a monkey trainer working with some capuchin monkeys. Well, she thinks they're all cute and sweet, but one day something happens and one of those monkeys bites her, and Jane just develops an intense fear of any monkey. That she gets so afraid to the point that just seeing a picture of a monkey, or maybe even watching a National Geographic documentary about a monkey, she can't do it. That fear, that phobia overcomes her. So so she went to a behavioral therapist. They would start out small like that. They would, first they would talk about it, because with a lot of people with phobia, with that intensive a phobia, as just even talking about it, they can't even do that. So they'd start out with making her talk about her fear, and then they'd maybe introduce a picture of a monkey, and then maybe they would get a little stuffed animal of a monkey, and eventually, graduate Jane up until where she's actually in the presence of, a real life monkey, and her phobia is not there anymore, and that's extinction too, like we said with the little Albert and the other experiment with little Peter there. Alrighty, so next we have social learning theory. And once again, make sure you go watch the YouTube video there. Social learning theory was developed by Albert Bandura, and maybe you guys have heard of his experiment. It's the Bobo doll experiment. It's where he took Bobo dolls, were like these famous toys in 50s, maybe early 60s, but they're kind of like a blow-up cutout of this like clown, and it's a blow-up, and it's kind of made out of plastic. So it kind of just kind of sits there and kind of teeters and toddles. If anybody remembers Weeble Wobbles from the 80s, how they had those little rounded bottoms, and they were kind of just, they'd never fall over, but they would just kind of, bounce and kind of move around. So think of that like, that's kind of like what a Bobo doll is. And so he did this experiment where he showed people beating up this Bobo doll, and then, showed it to these little kids and looked to see, which little kids imitated that behavior, which is called modeling or shaping, and which of those kids didn't. And it was all based on the idea that violence on TV led to violent behavior in children. And like I said, our little YouTube video, students usually like that. It's kind of, the guy who does it is kind of silly. But it's a good little overview of Bandura there. And so all of this social learning theory is based on this idea of modeling or shaping. And basically what that means is that we learn from observation. Monkey see, monkey do type learning. And next we have the cognitive developmental perspective. And cognitive developmental, or we can call them a cognitive behavioral therapist. This whole idea of putting that cognitive onto it is kind of response to behavioralism, and that just not focusing on the thoughts and how those relate it to behavior. With cognitive, they're definitely looking at that interplay there of how our thinking influences our behaviors. And along those lines, a big part of how we think is how we believe. And so, with cognitive perspective of anything in psychology, it's, that what we think, what we believe relates to our behavior and how we interact with others. And so with cognitive development, we're looking at the way that our thinking changes throughout time. And one of the main pioneers in the field of cognitive development perspective is Piaget. That is how you say that, Piaget. I think he's Austrian, I do believe. And for Piaget, this is here where we go and what I was talking about, how, with some of these developmental stages, we think that they like stop and they're very they're very fixed. And Piaget is one of those guys, because you see he has these 4 stages of cognitive development. And when you look at it, it's each of these stages, something different is going on. So at that sensory motor stage, that's when we'll start to get an idea of the world around us, things like object permanence, so that we kind of understand that when something, when you put your hands behind your face, you don't indeed disappear. As babies, at first they do think that you disappear because they don't have that idea of object permanence, but they begin to develop that as their sensory motor skills. So as they're hearing, they're smelling. Think about our 5 senses: they're hearing, they're smelling, they're tasting. How all those are starting to develop and then relate to what's going on in their brains. And then as you move up these stages, this is when we start to get seeing real development in our cognitive skills by the way we understand ourselves in the outside world. And so it's really then when we get to that, so at that pre-operational stage, we're just starting to get an understanding of ourselves and maybe the outside world, but we're really kind of stuck in ourselves, right? We're very self-centered at that age, and we don't have a really good understanding of what other people think at that point. But once we get to about that concrete operational stage, this is kind of where we get to where we start understanding abstract things. We understand that we're not the only ones that exist in the world, and that other people have thoughts and emotions and things just like we do. And then we get to that formal operational stage at pretty much adolescence there, and we stay stuck in that until death. And, at that stage, we're saying that we have a complex understanding of life, of things that go on in life. And this is where a criticism would be for Piaget, because that I think we can definitely take that formal operational stage and break it down, because what you know at 30 is way different from what you know at 11, and your understanding of that is going to be different, because you have to counter in those experiences we have as we grow older. So just a little side note there, my own maybe criticism of Piaget. And for Piaget, he thought that cognitive development came through assimilation and accommodation. And with assimilation is when we're taking new information and combining that with old information. And then with accommodation, it's more adapting. So it's taking all that information that we knew and changing it into something new. And Piaget's major contribution there is that he envisioned children as active organisms who strive to make sense out of the world. This is very important too, because probably wasn't until about, probably we'll say about 30s, 40s, 50s, it might have, I mean, especially around the 1950s, we start really getting into child development. But before that, people thought as children as just little adults. They didn't see that, there were these different developmental stages. And that's kind of why, beginning of Industrial Revolution, a lot of kids worked in factories too. And it was kind of World War II, kind of with Freud coming up with his theories, is that we started to change and realize that children were kind of different from adults, you can say, in that what was going, that they necessarily didn't have the same cognitive, social emotional capacities that adults had, because they were still developing. And there's just a little chart there with Piaget's stages of development, and oh, there you go, there is the description of those stages there. Alright, so now we're going to go through and look at our contemporary theories there, and those are just a list of each of those we're going to go through. So first we have our ecological perspective, which emphasizes the context and in which development occurs. So what that means is that we're looking at specific things and the relationships that those play in our environment. So something like how a child develops, how that immediate environment plays a role in that. Those people that child surrounded with, that type of setting that the child encounters over time. For humanist Carl Rogers, he believed that for individuals to develop into healthy adults, that they needed, a positive and encouraging childhood environment. And so that's kind of what the ecological perspective is looking at. We're looking at all those different networks. So think of it once again as those layers, those different layers of society. So, looking at the relationship between family, between school, between peer groups. We're looking at, the historical context, the cultural context, things like socioeconomic context. And there's just a little diagram of that, so we can really see that idea of those layers there, and how as a child grows and develops, each parts of those system plays a role in that. Alright, now we have the socio-cultural perspective. And for the socio-cultural perspective, they're really looking at how culture is that key factor in development. And when it comes down to it, the sociocultural perspective is it's looking at all influence of a child's environment. So it's not just those specific cultural things that we see with the ecological view, but it's looking at kind of everything that's shaping the environment and then the child's development there. Next, we have behavioral genetics, and that's the study of inherited behavior, focusing on the reciprocal relationships between genetics and experience. And rather than really looking at which behaviors are inherited or not, they're really looking at more of how much of a behavior is genetic and how much is environmental. Good example would be personality. How much of our personality is innate, ingrained in us, and lies in our genes, and how much of our personality, is related to those outside environmental influences. Next, we have the evolutionary perspective, and so with this one, we're looking at child development kind of in light of human evolutionary history. So think about what I was saying just a few minutes ago about with that ecological perspective, and then before when I was talking about how we view children and before the 1950s. So with that, we're looking at those evolutionary perspective of how do children develop in regards to survivability and adaptability. And so when it comes down to it, with evolutionary perspective, we're taking a broader look and looking at those universals, whereas with those behavioral geneticists, they're really interested in more of those primary individual differences. And with evolutionary perspective, what we're doing is we're trying to, pinpoint exactly in the history of human evolution when certain behaviors, when they came about, basically. So something like, phobias. Are phobias something that are innately ingrained in us, or are they something that is, like what Watson did, or are they something we're conditioned to? So look at things like that. They would look at things like talking, that's a good one. How communication evolved and where we started talking and how that related to the development of, us as human beings. And sometimes, a lot of time, evolutionary psychologists, they study other primates. As humans, we are primates. We're the part of the primates or the great apes, we could say, but it's humans, gorillas, orangutans, chimpanzees, and I believe bonobos might be kind of one that's kind of in the middle there, but definitely those first four. And so we look at these other non-human primates and try to see how they behave and try to look at it as how that relates to our development. So anthropology, physical anthropology, archaeology play a key role in these endeavors. One of the Jane Goodall, maybe you guys have heard of her. She's really famous for studying chimpanzees, and it's because of her studies of chimpanzees when she started out when she was 18 back in the 70s, along with anthropologists, the Leakeys. They were famous for finding the oldest human remains at Odaval Gorge over in Africa, and because of Jane Goodall studying the chimpanzees, they were able to figure out how those species there in Odaval Gorge, not species, but how those humans in Odaval Gorge lived 100 million years ago. So really play there. When it comes down to it, with all these social science fields, we play upon all of each other. We need each other to work together. It's kind of that reciprocal relationship there. Last, we have the dynamic systems perspective, and with this one, we're highlighting how development is part of a single coherent yet ever-changing system that has multiple layers of development and context. And with that, they're looking at how those different parts of the system works, and how, if you change one, how's that going to influence the whole thing. And a good example of that is be looking at cognitive development and how that relates to academic performance or social behavior. Think back to what I was talking about the ADHD and criminality study there. And for the dynamic systems perspective, the key thing there with them is that you can't study the individual without any context, because when it comes down to it, the outside influences are always going to play some part there. So we always have to look at the interplay of all those different parts of the system. Alright, so when it comes down to it, developmental psychology is a science, and like all, excuse my misspelling there, sciences, we use the scientific method. And the scientific method is a systematic procedure for testing ideas. It's a process all researchers and scientists use to help them ask and answer questions. And doing experiments is asking those questions, making observations. They're all critical process of doing research. And when it comes down to it, all research starts with a question, and that then is what leads to research, testing, and then our conclusions. And what's really important is that in that final step, that conclusion, or we say application, replication, is, you want to be able to replicate your results, because we want to show that the information is relevant to society, and once again, we want to be able to help people. So, the more definitive and the more accurate your testing, your data is, then the more definitive your conclusion is, and the more you can make that applicable to society. And the more sound you make your argument, that's then where that replication, that's then where validity and reliability to come in. Because if people can replicate what you did in your test and come up with similar results, then you're doing something good. Alright, and so when it comes to research, we want to always, the first step there always involves that collection of our observed experimental data. So, we always have to go out. We have to start with that question, and then we have to go out and start collecting our data. And when it comes to psychology, we have observational research, and we also have studies that we do. So first we have naturalistic observation, and that's when you're just observing people in their everyday settings. And usually you don't interact with the participants, but there is some kind of checklist, some kind of guidelines that they have to abide by. Think of some of these probably reality shows or a little bit of naturalistic observation shows like Pawn Stars, Storage Wars, or like those, because the people who are recording them are not interacting with them, but they kind of have them, a set of standards of how they're supposed to behave. And we have participant observation, and in participant observation, you can interact with those that you are observing, and usually that comes in the context of interviews. A lot of cultural anthropologists, when they go to other cultures, they do participant observation, to where they interact with the members of society. They do things like interview and participate in rituals, but they also then take the approach of standing back and observing what the people do too. And the advantage is that you can actually see the behaviors in that real world context, but the disadvantage is that sometimes it may take a long time to actually observe it, because it just may be a rare behavior. And then to go along with naturalistic observation, we have structure observation. And this is when researchers, they set up the experiment to evoke the behaviors they want to observe. So something like measuring emotions in children. So they would set up a room to where they had these situations where they had the mother and children playing in the room, and they would look to see which toys the child liked or didn't like. And And with structured observations, we're ensuring that the behavior that you want to occur actually occurs. And the disadvantage of that is that, the participants, you just may not get the behavior that you want because of the unfamiliar settings. Other observations are self-reports, and I won't read all this off to you guys. I know I'm running really long here. If we were in class, we'd already had a break. But self-report, on that note, if you want to take a break, you can always pause this and take a break. Self-reports are just questionnaires or interviews where the individual participants are going to answer some type of questions, give some report based on themselves. And most of the time, these are usually like keyed, scored tests, and we do that to collect a large amount of data. However, we have to be aware of bias because sometimes people just aren't honest, or they don't understand the questioning, and so we have to be really careful when it comes down to the way we make our testing and our assessment for people, because we always want to have that reliability and validity. And reliability there is that consistency, and validity is meaning it means that the test measures what it's supposed to measure. So if you want to measure depression, you're not going to ask people, oh well, let's see, what would be a good one. Yeah, if you're going to measure depression, you're not going to ask people something that doesn't relate to depression. So, you maybe not going to ask them, like, what's their favorite color, or, something that doesn't relate to it. It's all going to be, things that have to relate to maybe self-esteem, self-worth, and the more reliable and valid you can make those tests, the more consistent your data you're going to have, the more able people are going to be to answer consistently and unbiasedly. And to go along with all of that, we have standardized tests. That's a lot of the way that we go about testing in psychology, is with standardized tests, and there's the definition for that there. Alright, next we have case studies. So now this is now what we're going to do is kind of look at, so those are the type of assessments we do, so about how we go about getting our data. Now we're going to go and look at how we go about testing our data. And a case study, this is when you have maybe you follow one individual, a small group, or individual, and this is basically you just follow these people around in their lives and kind of see what's going on with them, and then you can kind of use those as a way to indicate just pretty much anything you want. So right there, if you want to look at two boys that grow up in the housing projects, you're looking at how that environment influences them as children, how they grow into an adults, and a case study is something that kind of follows somebody for an amount of time. And the problem with case studies is that you can't really generalize them. They're very specific to the individual or the group that's being studied, but they're still interesting nonetheless and help us learn something about particular individuals and particular groups. Then, of course, we have correlational studies, and these are most studies you will see is when we have two or more variables that are indicating a type of relationship, and we want to indicate that relationship in a way that it can be counted or measured. And along with that, we're looking for positive correlations and negative correlations. So we're looking to see how that relationship, how those two variables interact with each other. And sometimes, they can both interact in a way to where we have that positive indication. Sometimes it's a negative indication. And of course, this is the most commonly used research. And even though we're looking at relationship between variables, we can't necessarily say that one variable indicates the other. So let's think about Bandera there, and the Bobo doll experiment. Does violence on television produce violent children? Those would be your two variables there. And It just depends on this people you're studying whether you would have a correlation that would be positive to show that the more violent TV you watch, the more violent behavior, or the less violent TV, the less behavior. Doesn't really mean that that is exactly what's causing that violent behavior. So we have to be aware of that, and we have to remember that there are other variables. We always have our independent and our dependent variable, but we can also have a third variable, or we call those confounding variables. And there's just a little chart there that just kind of shows us a visual aid of kind of what we're talking about here with these correlations. Alright, and so once again, looking at how we go about testing our data, experiments, other than doing test and correlational studies, experiments are a big part of how we do research. And then, we're looking for that cause and effect relationship. With an experiment, this is where we also, like with correlational studies, we have our variables. We have our independent variable and our dependent variable. The independent variable is the one that's being manipulated, and it's the one that causes the dependent variable. And when it comes to experiments, we always have groups of people. So we always have our experimental group, and we have our control group. The control group, they're the ones that don't get the specialized treatment. So think about a group about weight loss study and taking a pill. The experimental group would receive the pill, and then the control group would probably get something like a placebo. So the control group is the one that's kind of, you can think of it as they're the ones being tricked, because they're not, they're there just to see what happens kind of in the normal, realm of what's going on, as opposed to the experimental group, who's actually, they're researching and studying them to see what the effects of, for instance, that pill is doing. And when it comes down to it, a lot of times when we do experiments, we always randomly assign participants. Sometimes even the researchers don't know until the end of the experiment who was in what group there. One of the advantages of an experiment is control, but we have to be careful with that, because if the researcher is exerting too much control in there, then that's kind of going to and create kind of a false negative or false results there. So we want to always try to be as real life with our experiments as we can, and sometimes that means we do have to remove some of our own control. And so one way that we can kind of overcome control, and then of course ethical issues are a big part of experiments too, because you have to make sure that that laboratory atmosphere you're creating, that you're not causing any harm to your subjects or participants. And a way that you can kind of circumvent that is by doing a natural experiments. And a natural experiment is when you compare existing groups to determine if difference exists. And one of the drawbacks is that that determination of causation is impossible to explain. Basically, what that means is that even though you have these comparisons between these groups, you really can't say what variables are influencing what. Think about it in terms of, say, sex or race. We could say that one of the big experiments they did, 30s, 40s, 50s, was looking at sex differences, and because most men have larger body and bone structures, and therefore bigger heads and bigger brains than women, that meant that they were more intelligent than women. But you can't really correlate things like brain size with intelligence, and as far as denoting men and women. I think you guys understand what I mean there. Alright, and so when it comes to developmental psychology, we are studying change over time. So we have three types of studies there: longitudinal, cross-sectional, and accelerated longitudinal. And with longitudinal, it's kind of like case studies where you're studying people over a time period, but kind of with that, it's at intervals. So maybe it would be like they would just check in with you once a week to where you're not like actually there in their house with the camera set up. Cross-sectional is when you study individuals of different ages at the same time. They're less expensive. They give you more immediate results. A lot of the experiments that Piaget did would be cross-sectional, because he would take, say, 3 or 4 different 7-year-olds and have 2 glasses of water that were different shaped but held the same amount of liquid, and then test them. They would take that water and pour it into the different shaped container and be like, now is there more or less water, and then judge how each child interpreted, it could see any difference or whatnot there, right? And now then we have accelerated longitudinal study, and this is when we have a combination of cross-sectional and longitudinal, And with the accelerated ones, they take more time than cross-sectional, but they're less time than longitudinal, because usually you have a fixed time period. And there's just a little chart that kind of shows us some ideas there of those studies. And then when it comes down to it, all of what we're studying about development and growth and change over time, and whether and how we employ the scientific method or any of these principles or any of these theories that we've talked about, we must do our research from an ethical standpoint. And the APA is the American Psychological Association. They have a list of ethical codes overall that all psychologists follow. There's a link to where if you want to go check those codes out. But these the codes here are set up by developmental psychologists, by the Society for Research on Child Development. And these 6 main codes here really align with the APA ethical code. So, I mean, you never want to cause any harm to your participants. You always have to have their consent. You always must be confidential. You must debrief the participants. And debriefing is just explaining to them what they're in for. And, in any time in an experiment, a participant is always allowed to not continue with that experiment. And implications, so the researcher, they must consider the implications of their finding. How is that going to help or hurt society overall? And then misconduct, you always want to behave in a respectful and ethical way. Alright, and developmental science is used for parents, teachers, healthcare practitioners, program developer, policy makers, members of business and industry, and we need to understand development over time. So, we can make services better for people, and in this context, on this, we're looking at it for children. So, we definitely look at developmental childhood development so that we can help children have better experiences, better products and services in life. And that is the end of our presentation, guys. Make sure you go and look over the Canvas shell to get your activities that you need. I can't wait to meet everybody next week in class. If you need me before then, you can email me. You can send me you can give me a phone call if you want. We can set up an online office visit where we actually can be on the computer, kind of like a video chat or something, and see each other in my online office. And all right, guys, that's it. Thanks. Bye.